The moment I stepped onto Diddy's private jet, I felt like I had entered another world. The air seemed different, crisper, scented faintly of something expensive that I couldn't quite place, a mix of leather and what I imagined luxury must smell like. The outside of the jet gleamed under the hangar lights, its surface so polished that it mirrored everything around it, including my own awestruck expression. I had been invited as a guest of a guest, someone who had connections I didn't fully understand, and the opportunity felt surreal, as though I were stepping into a dream. Before we start, hit the like and subscribe buttons for more exclusive news. Inside, the jet was a masterpiece of opulence. Every inch of it screamed extravagance in a way that was almost overwhelming. The walls were lined with smooth, cream-colored leather that looked like it had been handcrafted. Gold trim outlined every surface, gleaming in a soft, warm light that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. Plush seats were arranged in a manner that managed to be both practical and indulgent, each one looking more like a throne than a mere chair. There was a bar stocked with liquors I couldn't pronounce, crystal glasses perfectly arranged like they were part of an art installation. Diddy himself exuded an aura of effortless cool as he greeted everyone on board. He was dressed casually in a designer tracksuit, yet there was something about him that made even that look regal. He nodded at me, and I felt like I had been acknowledged by royalty. It was the kind of moment you replay in your mind, trying to convince yourself it actually happened. The flight began smoothly enough. We were served champagne before takeoff. An aged vintage poured into flutes that probably cost more than my monthly rent. The attendants, dressed impeccably in tailored uniforms, moved like dancers through the cabin, ensuring everyone was comfortable. I remember looking out of the window as we ascended, the city below shrinking into a tapestry of lights, and thinking, is this how the other half lives? But as the hours passed, a strange feeling began to settle over me. It wasn't something I could immediately place, a subtle, creeping unease that seemed to hang in the air like an invisible mist. At first, I chalked it up to being out of my element. After all, I wasn't used to this kind of environment, surrounded by people who exuded wealth and confidence like it was second nature. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with every passing minute. It started with the music. Diddy, ever the entertainer, had curated a playlist that pulsed through the cabin's state-of-the-art sound system. At first, it was upbeat and energizing, a mix of his own hits and other iconic tracks that set the mood for what I assumed would be a celebratory flight. But then, the tone of the music shifted. The bass grew heavier, the melodies darker. A haunting quality crept into the tracks, as though the music itself was alive and trying to tell us something. I remember glancing around to see if anyone else had noticed, but the other passengers seemed unfazed, laughing and sipping their drinks. Then there was the mirror. It was mounted on one side of the cabin, an enormous, ornate thing that seemed out of place even in such a lavish setting. Its frame was carved with intricate patterns that looked almost ancient, like something you'd find in a museum rather than on a modern jet. At first, I admired its craftsmanship, but as the flight went on, I began to notice something odd. Every time I caught my reflection in the mirror, it seemed slightly off. Just enough to make me do a double take. My expression wouldn't quite match what I was feeling, or the lighting would shift in a way that didn't make sense. It was subtle, but once I noticed it, I couldn't stop looking. The attendants too began to seem strange. They moved with the same grace as before, but there was something mechanical about it now, as though they were following a script. Their smiles felt a little too perfect, their eyes a little too unblinking. One of them offered me a drink, and as I reached out to take it, I noticed that her hand was ice cold. She didn't flinch, didn't seem to notice at all. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself I was just imagining things, but the unease continued to grow. As the flight went on, I began to notice other oddities. The temperature in the cabin seemed to fluctuate without warning, going from warm and cozy to uncomfortably cold in a matter of seconds. The lighting, which had been soft and golden at the start, began to flicker intermittently, casting strange shadows that danced across the walls. At one point, I thought I saw one of the shadows move independently, slithering across the floor like a living thing. I blinked, and it was gone, but the image stayed with me. The other passengers seemed oblivious to it all, or perhaps they were too engrossed in their own conversations and indulgences to care. I tried to join in, to lose myself in the atmosphere of wealth and luxury, but the strange occurrences kept pulling me back. The unease had settled deep into my bones by now, a constant gnawing sensation that refused to let me relax. And then there was the dream, or at least, I think it was a dream. I must have dozed off at some point, lulled by the hum of the engines and the champagne in my system. In the dream, I was still on the jet, but it was empty, eerily silent. The lights were dim, and the mirror on the wall seemed to glow faintly, as though it were alive. I walked toward it, compelled by a force I couldn't resist, and as I got closer, I saw that my reflection wasn't mine at all. It was someone else, a figure that looked like me but wasn't. Its eyes were darker, its expression more sinister. It raised a hand to the glass, and I felt an overwhelming urge to do the same, to touch it. Just as our fingers were about to meet, I woke up with a start. The jet was as lively as ever when I woke, the other passengers laughing and chatting as though nothing was amiss. But the feeling from the dream lingered, a weight in my chest that I couldn't shake. I glanced at the mirror, half expecting to see the figure still there, but it was just my own reflection staring back at me, pale and shaken. By the time we landed, I was desperate to get off the jet. The experience had left me rattled in a way I couldn't fully explain, even to myself. As I stepped onto the tarmac, the cool night air hitting my face, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. But the unease didn't leave me entirely. It followed me home, creeping into my dreams and lingering in the corners of my mind. The weeks after the flight were strange, almost dreamlike in their disjointedness. I tried to return to normal life, to immerse myself in the routines that had always grounded me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something from that experience had clung to me. It was as if I had brought a fragment of the jet back with me, something intangible yet undeniably present. It began subtly, in the small hours of the night when the world was quiet. Shadows seemed deeper, darker than before. My apartment, which had always been a refuge, felt unnervingly unfamiliar, like a space I was seeing for the first time. The mirror in my hallway, the one I'd passed 1,000 times without a second thought, began to make me uneasy. I'd catch myself glancing at it more often, expecting to see what? I didn't know. All I knew was that it felt different now, and I couldn't explain why. The dreams, too, became relentless. Each night, I would find myself back on the jet, alone in that dimly lit cabin. The haunting reflection from the mirror would be there, always waiting for me, its features more distinct, and its presence more menacing with every encounter. It never spoke or moved beyond its initial gesture of reaching toward the glass. But its eyes, those impossibly dark eyes, seemed to bore into my very soul. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, the image burned into my mind like a brand. I tried to push it all aside, to tell myself it was just my imagination running wild. But strange things kept happening. Electronics in my apartment began to behave oddly. Lights flickering at random, my television turning on by itself to static-filled screens. Even my phone seemed affected with strange glitches that I couldn't explain. On one particularly unsettling occasion, I received a text message that appeared to be from myself. It contained only one word: mirror. My stomach dropped, and I immediately deleted it, refusing to dwell on what it might mean. As the days turned into weeks, I became increasingly paranoid. I started avoiding mirrors altogether, covering them with blankets or towels to block them from view. It felt ridiculous, childish even, but the relief it brought was undeniable. Still, the sense of being watched never entirely left me. It followed me everywhere. At work, on the street, even in the company of friends. I couldn't escape it, and the more I tried, the stronger it seemed to grow. One evening, desperate for answers, I decided to do some research. I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone about what I was experiencing. It sounded too bizarre, too absurd. Instead, I turned to the internet, hoping to find some explanation, or at least a similar story that might reassure me I wasn't losing my mind. I started with simple searches: weird feelings after flying, strange experiences on planes, but nothing relevant came up. Then I tried something more specific: haunted private jet. To my surprise, I found a forum thread that stopped me in my tracks. It was buried deep in a niche corner of the web, a discussion among people sharing odd experiences with luxury travel. One post in particular caught my attention. The user described a flight they had taken on a private jet, one that sounded eerily similar to Diddy's. They mentioned the unsettling atmosphere, the inexplicable sensations, and most disturbingly, a mirror on board that seemed to have a life of its own. My heart raced as I read their account, each detail aligning almost perfectly with my own experience. The thread had only a handful of replies, but one stood out. It was from another user who claimed to be an expert in paranormal phenomena. They suggested that certain objects, particularly mirrors, could act as conduits for otherworldly energy. According to them, a mirror on a private jet could be particularly potent due to the constant movement and elevation, amplifying whatever energy it already carried. They warned that anyone who interacted with such an object might carry its influence with them, even long after leaving its presence. The post left me shaken, but also strangely validated. I wasn't imagining things, at least not entirely. Still, the knowledge didn't bring much comfort. If anything, it made my situation feel even more dire. What was I supposed to do now? How did one rid themselves of an otherworldly influence? The idea was so far outside the realm of anything I had ever dealt with that I didn't even know where to begin. That night, I decided to take action. I wasn't sure what I was doing or if it would help, but I felt I had to try something. I started by burning sage in my apartment, a ritual I had read about in one of the many articles I had frantically searched through. The smell was pungent, filling every corner of my space as I moved through the rooms, murmuring a quiet plea for peace. I also placed bowls of salt near the mirrors I couldn't remove, a practice I had learned was supposed to absorb negative energy. It felt both silly and desperate, but I was willing to try anything. For a while, it seemed to work. The strange sensations lessened, and the dreams became less vivid. I began to think that maybe, just maybe, I had put it all behind me. But then, one night, the mirror in my hallway shattered. It happened around midnight, a sharp, deafening sound that jolted me awake. I ran to the hallway to find shards of glass scattered across the floor, the blanket I had draped over the mirror lying in a crumpled heap nearby. My heart pounded as I stared at the mess, unable to comprehend what had just happened. There was no reason for the mirror to break. It hadn't been touched or disturbed. It was as if it had exploded from within. I spent the rest of the night cleaning up the glass, every nerve in my body on edge. When I finally crawled back into bed, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. My mind raced with questions, fears, and the growing realization that this wasn't something I could handle on my own. The next day, I reached out to a local spiritual advisor. It wasn't something I ever thought I'd do, but desperation has a way of pushing you beyond your usual boundaries. The advisor, an older woman with a calm and knowing demeanor, listened intently as I recounted my story. She didn't laugh or dismiss me, which was a relief in itself. Instead, she nodded thoughtfully, as though everything I was saying made perfect sense. "You've encountered something powerful," she said. "Not evil necessarily, but certainly not benign. Mirrors are portals, and whatever was on that jet has found a way to stay connected to you." Her words sent a chill down my spine. "What can I do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She recommended a cleansing ritual, one that would involve not just my apartment but also myself. It was a process that required focus, intention, and a willingness to let go of whatever energy had attached itself to me. She gave me a list of items to gather: candles, herbs, and a small ornate mirror that she said would act as a neutralizer. The ritual took place the following evening. It was a solemn affair, the air heavy with the scent of burning herbs and the flickering glow of candlelight. The advisor guided me through the steps, her voice steady and reassuring as she chanted ancient words I didn't understand. At one point, she instructed me to hold the small mirror and gaze into it, confronting whatever presence had attached itself to me. The moment was intense, the air around me seeming to hum with energy. For a brief second, I thought I saw the dark-eyed figure from my dreams staring back at me, but then it was gone. When the ritual was over, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The air in my apartment seemed lighter. The oppressive atmosphere that had lingered for weeks finally lifted. The advisor assured me that the connection had been severed, but she also warned me to be cautious in the future. "These things leave traces," she said. "You may not feel it now, but the experience has changed you." She was right. Even now, months later, I feel different. The nightmares have stopped, and the strange occurrences in my apartment have ceased. But a part of me will always carry the memory of that flight, and the strange, haunting energy of that mirror. It's not something I talk about often, mostly because it sounds too unbelievable to anyone who hasn't experienced something similar. But every so often, when I catch my reflection in the glass, I think about that otherworldly presence and wonder, was it truly gone? Or is it just waiting for the right moment to return? The lingering effects of that flight transformed more than just my nights. They seeped into my days, into the small, ordinary rituals of my life. I became hyper-aware of reflective surfaces. Not just mirrors, but anything that could hold an image. Windows, puddles, even the glossy surface of a polished table. Each one seemed to watch me, capturing not just my reflection, but something more. Something that felt as though it was waiting just beneath the surface. In the months following the cleansing ritual, I tried to distract myself with work and social obligations. I went to meetings, smiled at colleagues, and laughed at jokes that weren't particularly funny, all in an effort to convince myself that everything was normal. But deep down, I knew better. I couldn't shake the feeling that the events on Diddy's jet had left a mark on me, one that wasn't so easily erased. It wasn't just the fear that haunted me, it was the questions. Why had this happened? What was the significance of that mirror? And why, of all people, had I been the one to experience it? The more I thought about it, the more I became convinced that the answers lay in the jet itself. I needed to know more about it, to understand what might have caused such an experience. Driven by curiosity and a nagging sense of unfinished business, I began to dig deeper. I combed through articles, interviews, and forums, trying to piece together the jet's history. What I found was both fascinating and unsettling. The jet, it seemed, wasn't just a symbol of wealth and power, it had a story, one steeped in rumors and mystery. The jet had been custom-built years ago, its design overseen by one of the most sought-after aviation architects in the world. It was a marvel of engineering and luxury, but it also had a strange reputation. According to several accounts, the jet had changed hands multiple times before Diddy acquired it. Each previous owner, for reasons that were never fully explained, had sold it within a year or two. One particularly chilling story involved an owner who abruptly retired from the public eye after claiming the jet was cursed. The mirror, I discovered, had been a late addition to the jet's design. It was commissioned specifically for the cabin, sourced from a collector of rare antiques. Its origins were murky at best, with some sources suggesting it had been part of an estate sale from a historic manor in Europe. Others claimed it had been removed from an abandoned asylum. Regardless of its provenance, one thing was clear: the mirror had a history of its own, one that seemed to carry an air of unease wherever it went. The deeper I delved, the more the pieces began to fit together. This wasn't just a case of overactive imagination or the lingering effects of a surreal experience. There was something real, something tangible about the strange energy I had felt. It wasn't confined to me, it was part of the jet, and perhaps even part of its history. Determined to get more answers, I reached out to the user who had written about their similar experience on the forum. To my surprise, they responded quickly, eager to share their story. We arranged a video call, and within minutes of speaking, I felt a strange sense of camaraderie. They too had felt the inexplicable pull of the jet and the mirror, though their experience had been different in detail. They described a feeling of being watched, a sense of déjà vu so intense it bordered on paranoia. They had also seen something in the mirror, though they wouldn't go into detail. "It's better not to dwell on it," they said, their voice heavy with a mixture of fear and resignation. What struck me most about our conversation was their warning. "The jet," they said, "isn't just a mode of transport, it's like a living thing or maybe a vessel for something else. Whatever you felt, whatever you saw, it's part of that. And once you've been touched by it, it's hard to let go." Their words stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. I realized that part of me didn't want to let go. As terrifying as the experience had been, it was also captivating. It had opened a door to something larger than myself, something beyond the mundane. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stumbled upon a secret, one that most people would never encounter. It was around this time that I began to notice strange coincidences in my daily life. Numbers would repeat themselves in odd ways, on clocks, receipts, even the pages of books I was reading. Songs from the flight's playlist would play randomly on the radio or in stores, despite being obscure tracks that I had never heard before. At first, I dismissed these as mere chance, but as they continued to happen, I began to wonder if they were signs, fragments of the jet's influence still lingering in my life. One evening, as I was walking home from work, I passed a boutique that I had never noticed before. Its window display was filled with antique furniture and decor, but what caught my attention was a mirror. It wasn't identical to the one on the jet, but it had a similar aura, an air of mystery that seemed to draw me in. I found myself standing outside the shop, staring at the mirror for what felt like an eternity. It was only when the shopkeeper appeared at the door, asking if I needed help, that I snapped out of my trance. I didn't buy the mirror, but the encounter left me shaken. It was a reminder that whatever had happened on the jet wasn't entirely in the past. It was still with me, lurking in the shadows of my mind and manifesting in the world around me. Eventually, I decided to reach out to Diddy himself. It was a long shot, but I felt I had to try. I framed my message carefully, not wanting to come across as unhinged or disrespectful. To my surprise, I received a reply, not from Diddy directly, but from someone on his team. They were polite but curt, assuring me that the jet had been thoroughly inspected and maintained to the highest standards. When I pressed further, mentioning the mirror and its strange effects, they simply said, "The mirror is an antique chosen for its aesthetic value. Any unusual experiences are purely coincidental." I wasn't satisfied with their response, but I didn't push the issue. What else could I do? This wasn't the kind of thing that could be explained away with logic or reason. It was something that existed on the fringes of understanding, a mystery that might never be fully solved. As time passed, I thought I had finally left the ordeal behind me. The strange events that followed the flight on Diddy's jet began to fade, replaced by the steady rhythm of day-to-day life. But even as I tried to convince myself that the experience was over, I couldn't shake the lingering sense that something fundamental had shifted. It was as though I had opened a door to another layer of reality, one that couldn't simply be closed again. The first indication that this chapter of my life wasn't truly over came on an unremarkable Tuesday evening. I was sitting at my desk sorting through a pile of paperwork when I noticed something peculiar. A reflection, faint and distorted, caught my eye in the surface of my coffee mug. At first, I assumed it was my own face, but the longer I stared, the less certain I became. The image wasn't clear enough to make out distinct features, but there was a flicker of movement that didn't align with the stillness of the room. I quickly set the mug down, my heart racing. It was a small moment, fleeting and easily dismissed, but it brought back memories I had tried to bury. The following days were filled with similar occurrences, each one subtle but undeniably unnerving. A glass on my kitchen counter would tremble slightly when I walked past it, despite no discernible vibrations in the room. A reflection in the window of a passing car would linger for just a fraction of a second too long. These moments weren't overtly supernatural, but they carried the same oppressive weight I had felt on the jet, a sense of being watched by something just outside the reach of perception. I started keeping a journal, documenting every odd occurrence in the hope that patterns might emerge. It felt like a futile exercise at first, a way to channel my anxiety more than anything else. But as I read back over my entries, I noticed a chilling consistency. The reflections, whether in glass, water, or polished surfaces, seemed to appear most often when I was alone or distracted, as if they were waiting for moments of vulnerability. And while they were always faint and fleeting, they were growing more frequent. Desperate for answers, I revisited the spiritual advisor who had performed the cleansing ritual in my apartment. She listened patiently as I described what had been happening, her expression growing more serious with every word. When I finished, she sighed heavily. "I had hoped this wouldn't happen," she said. "Sometimes when a connection is severed, it doesn't disappear entirely. It leaves traces like a shadow. What you're experiencing might not be the same presence you encountered before, but it's connected to it." Her explanation filled me with both dread and a strange sense of relief. At least I wasn't imagining things. She suggested a more intensive ritual, one that would require not just my home, but my entire self to be cleansed. It would involve fasting, meditation, and the use of specific herbs and oils to purify my energy. I agreed without hesitation, willing to try anything to rid myself of the lingering unease. The ritual was intense, far more demanding than I had anticipated. Over the course of 3 days, I followed the advisor's instructions to the letter. I meditated for hours at a time, burning bundles of sage and cedar as I chanted incantations meant to banish negativity. I bathed in water infused with salt and lavender, scrubbing my skin raw in an attempt to cleanse myself of whatever had attached itself to me. By the end of the 3rd day, I was physically and emotionally drained, but I felt lighter, as though a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had been lifted. For a time, it seemed to work. The strange occurrences stopped, and I began to feel like myself again. I even started to believe that the chapter had finally been closed. But then, one night, I had another dream. In the dream, I was back on the jet, alone in the dimly lit cabin. The air was thick and heavy, pressing down on me like an invisible force. The mirror was there, looming larger than I remembered, its surface rippling like water. As I approached it, I saw my reflection, but something was wrong. My face was distorted, twisted into an expression of fear and anguish. I tried to step back, but my feet wouldn't move. The reflection raised its hand, and though I stood frozen, I felt an icy grip close around my wrist. I woke up gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. The dream reignited all the fears I had worked so hard to suppress. It wasn't just a memory of the past. It felt like a warning, a reminder that whatever I had encountered wasn't gone. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to confront it head on. The idea of returning to the jet terrified me, but it also seemed like the only way to find closure. I reached out to the same intermediary who had responded on Diddy's behalf months earlier, framing my request as a desire to explore the unique features of the jet for a potential article. It was a flimsy pretext, but to my astonishment, they agreed. I was given access to the jet for a brief visit, under the condition that I was accompanied by a staff member at all times. Walking onto the jet again was like stepping into a memory. Everything was exactly as I remembered. The gleaming surfaces, the plush seats, the faint scent of leather and luxury. but the mirror was gone. When I asked the staff member about it, they hesitated before answering. The mirror was removed a few months ago. They said there were some incidents that made the owner uncomfortable. I pressed for more details, but they refused to elaborate. Their vague response only deepened my sense of unease. Where had the mirror gone, and what had happened to prompt its removal? The visit ended without any revelations, but it left me with more questions than answers. If the mirror was gone, why was I still experiencing its influence? Was it possible that its removal had unleashed something even more powerful? Something that could no longer be contained? In the weeks that followed, I found myself consumed by these questions. The dreams returned, each one more vivid than the last, and the strange reflections became more frequent. It was as if the presence I had encountered was growing stronger, feeding off my fear and uncertainty. One night, in a moment of desperation, I turned to the mirror in my hallway, the one I had avoided for so long. I uncovered it and stared into its surface, willing myself to confront whatever was haunting me. At first, all I saw was my own reflection, pale and drawn. But then, just as I was about to look away, the surface seemed to shimmer. A figure appeared, faint and shadowy, its features obscured but unmistakably familiar. It was the same figure from the jet, the one I had seen in my dreams. It didn't move or speak, but its presence was suffocating, filling the room with an oppressive energy. I felt an overwhelming urge to reach out, to touch the glass, but I forced myself to stay still. Instead, I whispered a single word: "Why?" The figure tilted its head as if considering my question. Then, slowly, it began to fade, its outline dissolving into the darkness of the room. When it was gone, the mirror was just a mirror again, its surface smooth and unremarkable. But I knew that this wasn't the end. Even now, I live with the knowledge that the presence is still out there, lurking in the shadows of my life. It's quieter now, less overt, but it's always there, a reminder of that fateful flight and the mysteries I uncovered. I've learned to coexist with it, to accept that some questions will never have answers. But every so often, when I catch a glimpse of my reflection, I can't help but wonder, is it really me looking back? Or is it something else, waiting for its moment to return? If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, could you leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on flying Diddy's private jet? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.